last video, we got the new pistons put on the rods. Now we're ready to start putting them in the engine. First thing you need to do is make sure your bore is perfectly clean. Use a rag and some solvent. Keep wiping it out until it comes out clean. Now I put one piston in. Number one is already in there. And I made a video of it, but I just wasn't real happy with the way it turned out. So we're going to video number 2 here. See if I do any better on it. Okay, happy with the way the bore is. We'll go grab a piston here. Now I've got a 0.0015 thousandths and a half feeler gauge here. We're going to lay it there, slip the piston down with it. With a brand new coated piston, you're supposed to have about a thousandths gap. This is a thousandths and a half, and that's about right where it's at. That is a nice tight grip on the feeler gauge. It's a little bit over book specs, but the factory specs are for a factory coated piston. Now, I have no idea if the coating on this is thicker, thinner than factory, but that's close enough for me. But a thousandths and a half is fine in my book. Since we don't know, this piston measures right. That's what the little dots are for. So you can use a mic and grab each side. So piston to cylinder wall clearance is good. You absolutely, like most things building an engine, a little bit loose is better than a little bit tight. So I'm using Hastings rings on this build because I always have good luck with them. Top ring goes in the top groove of the piston. It does not have any markings on it telling it which way, you know, one side up or one side down, so it can go either way. We need to slip it in the bore and check the gap. That slip your ring in. Then take your piston and push it down part way. I usually go to the bottom of the skirt on these. Pull it out. Now, we take a feeler gauge and measure that gap. And on the top ring, factory service, about 20 thousandths, 19 to 20 thousandths is considered the max gap. So we just take the feeler gauge, put it in that gap. This ends up just like the other side. It's right at 20 thousandths. So it's right at the max limit. So when I checked the first side, I thought, well, the cylinder's worn more than I thought. But then I checked the next 2 rings, and they were toward the minimum of the limit. So I am figuring it is probably just a difference in the way Hastings makes their rings. The top ring is the hottest. They gave it a little more room for expansion. And you absolutely want to make sure that you do have enough clearance. Too much is better than not enough, because what will happen is when this expands, the gap gets smaller and smaller as it gets hot. And if it doesn't have enough gap, the ends of the ring can actually butt together and lock in the cylinder, and it can literally rip the top off the piston. So I'm happy with the gap at 20. Set that ring there. We'll take the number 2 ring and see right there, it does say top. So it's the second ring down, but this side goes on the facing the top of the piston. Same deal, we'll slip it in. Push it down, and using the piston also squares it up in the bore so you get an accurate measurement. And on the second ring, it can go up from like 17 to 27,000. I always write down the service limits because I'm usually working with engines that are not fresh. Okay, that's a 26. It won't go in there, so it is less than the service limit. 17. Let's try the 17. 17 fits, and it's a snug fit. So it's right at the bottom. And that's what I was saying. It's evidently not the cylinder being worn. It just must be the way Hastings does their rings, because this gap is toward the minimum end, which is still fine. It has the proper amount of clearance. We'll set that aside. Now we'll do the same, checking the two really thin oil rails. Slide them in. They got the oil rail in there. Their gap goes anywhere from 7 thousandths to 32 thousandths. So a 7 fits in there. Let's try something bigger. 7 fits in. 20 does not. So you know it's somewhere in an acceptable range. Now we'll check the other rail, because each piston has 2 oil rails. Keep in mind, I check all of this stuff on each cylinder just to make sure that you don't get some kind of defective part. That's why I check all of it, because all it would take is one ring that's built wrong, and it could ruin your rebuild. So same on it, 20 won't fit. 7 fits in there just beautiful. So this oil ring is good too. Next thing we want to check is the side clearance between the ring and the groove in the piston. And it on the top ring should be, well, it's pretty close to the same on both of them, about 2 to 3 thousandths. So I've got a 2 thousandths feeler gauge right here. We'll go ahead and put it in the groove. Push it over with the ring. They fit together just fine, and that's actually a nice snug fit. So she's right at a 2. Now I also like to take it and roll the ring around the piston to make sure there's no tight spots on the piston, no damage to the ring lands. Just make sure it goes all the way around without binding up. So that ring is good. We'll check the number 2 ring. Same on it, a number 2 or 2 thousandths feeler gauge is just perfect as far as the side clearance. Roll it around. No problems. So those 2 rings are good. We'll go ahead and fit all the rings in here. Then we'll check side clearance on the oil pack, since it's a expander and the 2 rings. All right, now that we've got everything checked, let's put the rings on the piston. Now this is your oil expander. You see how the end of that is? When it's in the groove, you want those 2 ends butted up like that. You don't want them overlapping, underlapping, just butted up. And it's important to make sure once you get the scraper rings in there that that's how it ends up. So we'll start by just running it around, putting it in the oil groove. We've got the ends together, just like I said. We'll take one of the scrapers, and these do not matter which side goes up. Make sure it's clean. And we'll put it on the bottom of the expander. And these are thin enough that you can just spiral them on there, just like that. Now that we've got that on there, there's the expander, the end of it. It's still good. The instructions with the ring say to put the gap on the scraper 1 inch to each side of the expander. So we'll work that around. Get it to 1 inch on that side. So it's over there. The gap is right there. The expander's butted together there. The gap in the ring is over here. So now we'll take the second ring, the second scraper, and we will spiral it on just the same way, just on top of the expander. And I've got the end about an inch away from that gap. And it's in there. So there's where the expander is. We need to move this around just a little more. So those are on both sides of that expander joint. It is properly in there. So that's all good. Now let's check the side clearance. The side clearance on this pack here can be anywhere from nothing to like 7 mils or 7 thousandths. So there's a 2. Let's try a 7. 7 is a no-go. So it is, yeah, see, I can't slide the rings back in there. So it's good. Up next is your second ring. And like I said, it is marked top. So it'll be in the second groove, but it'll be positioned like this with the top, where it says top, facing up. Now I like to use a ring expander. Cheap tool. You just put the ends of the ring in there and you can pry the ring open evenly and bring it down and drop it into the groove. Now, rings say, well, I think it was the service manual says to put the ends of the gaps on the 2 top rings 180 degrees out. So we'll put one this way, we'll put the gap in the top ring over here. Here's the top ring. It doesn't have any indication, so it could go either side up. I'll just expand it out. Drop it in there. Put its gap here. That one there, and that is set up. Next up, we need to oil everything. We need to make sure there's oil down in the pin. Let's see, there's a little notch there that lets oil get down to the pin. The rings need to be oiled. So I just have a cup of oil here and I just go crazy with it. Just kind of roll it around, make sure to get oil on the sides, let it work its way down the pin. Make sure the rings are good. Put some along the inside. It's not going to hurt anything because once you've got this in there, in the bore, it will end up, any excess oil will just run out the bottom of the engine. So that's all good. What I'm going to do, and I mean, you can lube this stuff up however you want. I just get a little crazy. I'm going to take some of that excess oil and use it to lube up the cylinder. Try to make sure the cylinder is completely coated. And I just generally use my hand. You can put a glove on if you're worried about it, but if you use a rag, try to use something that's lint free so you're not getting lint all over your cylinder wall. Not that I really think that makes that big a difference. I mean, when you take an engine apart, there is just crap in the ring gaps, just carbon everywhere. So I'm not thinking a little bit of fuzz when you first put it together is going to hurt anything. But why not get it as clean as possible? So the cylinder's lubed. Now we'll put on the ring compressor. Give it one more look over, make sure your ring gaps are where you want them. Then you can cinch your ring compressor down on the piston. Just use care, making sure the rings go in their grooves, because when they're fresh like that, they're expanded way out. Okay, everything is in its groove where it should be. Of course, make sure the ring expander's clean before you put it on your nice clean piston. All right, I have the cap off the rod. I used to, on the older, like first gen, where they had the stud sticking out of the rod, you'd put a piece of hose or something on that to where you didn't ding up your crankshaft as you push this down in there. What I do on each one is just roll the crank around to where the crank is directly opposite and all the way down in the bore. And then this won't hit. You know, unless you just knock it all the way down in there. So you've got your arrow that faces to the front. You set it in there, slide the piston in. Sure your arrow's facing forward. And give it a shove. And there you go. Now we'll flip the engine over and work on the bearing. As you can see down in there, you weren't in any danger of getting the rod into the crank. So now, move the rod this way. We'll slide this back. And now we're going to check the bearing clearances for the rod. So move that where you can get a hold of it. Put a bearing shell in this side. Tab in the groove just like you did on the mains. Push it down in there. Nice and level. And hold the rod. You can push the piston back until it engages. Now it's on the crank. I'm going to take a wrench. Hold that up on the crank and rotate it a little bit like this. That way we've got a nice smooth spot there to put the plastic gauge, and we can get to the bolts. Take you a little piece of plastic gauge. Get it stuck there in the center. Sure it's crossways. I rotated the engine around a little bit. That way that connecting rod is facing straight up. That way that will set it 180 degrees from the rod. So now you're ready with your cap. Put an insert in it. It lined up. Make sure you have it going the right direction with the flats on the same side. Gonna buzz that down lightly. And now we can torque it down to smash the plastic gauge. To torque these rods, we go to 15 foot-pounds. And then, since this is a 2004 motor, we go to 75 degrees. And that applies, now always check your torque for your specific motor, but from what I read, 2001, 2004, 75 degrees, because that's when they came out with the LS block. Everything used the LS block. They upgraded the rod bolts so it can go a little tighter. If you're 97 to 2000, 65 degrees. We're going to bring this around to 75. Come over here. Bring it around to 75. And now we can take it right back apart. And there's your little strip of plastic gauge. And it is right at 2000s. And that is exactly where we want it. So now, like on the mains, clean that plastic gauge off with a little solvent. What I'm doing there is blowing all the oil off of this area where the rod is cracked. That is supposed to mate together just perfectly. That's why they're built this way, so I didn't figure it needs any oil in there. So now we'll slide the rod back down, put some assembly lube on it. and just put it in the bearing area. Bring it back up. Assembly lube on the bearing area at the cap. Put it back in place. 15 foot-pounds. And then 75 degrees again. And cylinder number 2 is done. One last little thing to check, since we've got both rods on here, is these rods share a journal. So there's a little bit of gap where they move. And that will be filled with oil when the engine's running. But the spec is 4 thousandths to 20 thousandths. Pry that apart. There's a 5 goes, 20 will not. So it's no problem. It's real good. I wouldn't expect that to be off. You can also check it by pushing them both to one side and checking it in between that and the edge of the crank. That would be something that could be off if you got different rods. Well, and I have mixed these rods up, so they're not probably not in the exact place they came out originally. But if you got different rods, I would definitely check that, because you want to have some gap there for oil. So it's good, so we can move on. I also like to roll it around after each one to make sure nothing's binding. If it was, now you'd be able to feel it. And you would know which one's which. Which one's bad, the one you just put in. So everything's good. Turns nice and smooth. Now I just need to repeat that 6 more times. We'll have all the pistons in there. Next video, I should have all the pistons in. We'll start with the rear cover, put the barbell in, rear cover, camshaft. Should be able to put the timing stuff on the front. So till then, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to keep up with this. See you on the next one.